The moment the glass doors slid open, the entire atmosphere inside the office shifted in a way that was hard to explain but impossible to ignore. Conversations slowed, keyboards lost their rhythm, and a quiet tension crept into the air as a sharply dressed man stepped inside with calm confidence. He didn't hesitate or look around in uncertainty. He walked in like he knew exactly where he was and exactly why he was there. The receptionist straightened up immediately, offering a polite greeting, but before she could finish her sentence, the man began speaking. His tone was steady, his expression composed, but his words were entirely in Mandarin. That single detail was enough to throw everything off balance. The receptionist froze for a split second, her polite smile tightening as she tried to process what she was hearing. She glanced toward the manager's office, clearly unsure how to respond, and within seconds, the message was passed along. The manager stepped out quickly, already forcing a professional smile, but there was a flicker of concern behind his eyes that he couldn't quite hide. He approached the guest with confidence that felt just slightly rehearsed, extending a hand and attempting to take control of the situation. But the moment the client continued speaking in Mandarin, it became painfully clear that this was not a situation he was prepared for. The manager's smile stiffened. His posture shifted. For a brief moment, he looked like someone trying to keep a fragile situation from slipping through his fingers. He nodded along as if he understood, even though it was obvious he didn't catch a single word. His responses became vague, filled with polite gestures and short phrases that bought him time but solved nothing. Inside, the pressure was building quickly. This wasn't just any visitor. This was a high-value client, someone whose presence alone carried weight, someone important enough that everything needed to go right. And yet, here he was, standing face to face with a communication barrier he had clearly underestimated. He glanced back toward his staff, hoping someone might step in, but the room offered no help. Employees avoided eye contact, suddenly very focused on their screens, as if staying out of it would make the problem disappear. The manager's mind raced. He thought about translation apps, about calling someone, about any quick fix that could rescue the situation before it turned into a complete embarrassment. But every second that passed without clear communication made the moment heavier. The client remained calm, patient even, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, a quiet awareness that he was not being understood. That awareness only made the manager more anxious. He began speaking more slowly, enunciating each word as if that would somehow bridge the gap, adding hand gestures that only made him look more uncertain. His confidence was slipping, replaced by a growing sense of urgency that he struggled to contain. This was not how things were supposed to go. He had built his reputation on being prepared, on handling high-stakes situations with ease, on never letting clients see even a hint of disorganization. And now, in the middle of his own office, in front of his own staff, he was losing control of a situation that should have been simple. The polished image he worked so hard to maintain was starting to crack, piece by piece, under the weight of a problem he didn't know how to solve. He forced a small laugh, trying to lighten the moment, but it didn't land. Instead, it hung awkwardly in the air, making the silence that followed feel even heavier. He adjusted his tie, a subtle gesture that betrayed his discomfort, and tried again, repeating himself in slightly different words, hoping for some sign of understanding. But the gap remained. The more he tried to recover, the more obvious it became that he was completely unprepared for this encounter, and that realization only made the panic settle in deeper, tightening its grip with every passing second. It didn't take long for the tension in the room to shift into something else, something quieter but far more revealing. As the manager struggled to keep control of the situation, his attention began to drift, not toward solutions, but toward the people around him. His eyes moved quickly across the office, scanning faces, not with curiosity or openness, but with judgment shaped by habit. He was no longer just looking for help. He was deciding who he believed was worth asking. The employees seated at their desks barely looked up, and when they did, it was only for a second before returning to their screens. Their silence wasn't just hesitation. It was a reflection of the unspoken hierarchy that defined the space, a structure where certain roles were seen as capable, and others were not even considered. The manager's thinking followed that same pattern without him realizing it. He focused on those in formal attire, those who looked the part, those whose job titles carried weight. Anyone outside of that narrow frame faded into the background, invisible not because they lacked ability, but because they didn't fit the image he trusted. His gaze skipped over the maintenance staff, the support workers, the people who moved quietly through the office without drawing attention. To him, they were part of the setting, not part of the solution. It was a habit built over time, reinforced by routine, where appearance and position quietly dictated expectations. The idea that someone outside his immediate professional circle could help in a high-stakes moment didn't even cross his mind. Instead, he leaned further into the assumptions that had always guided his decisions. He straightened his posture again, trying to regain authority, and spoke more loudly, as if volume could compensate for understanding. His tone carried a subtle shift, one that suggested control, but beneath it was a growing frustration. He wasn't just dealing with a language barrier anymore. He was dealing with the discomfort of being out of his depth, and that discomfort began to shape the way he saw everyone around him. He needed a quick fix, but only from the people he believed were capable of providing one. That belief was narrow, and it showed. A junior employee near the back glanced up briefly, as if considering whether to step in, but the manager's lack of acknowledgement made the decision for them. They lowered their eyes again, staying quiet, not because they had nothing to offer, but because the environment had already taught them when their voice would be welcomed and when it would not. The unspoken message was clear. If you didn't look like the solution, you weren't expected to be one. The manager continued to gesture and speak in incomplete phrases, his attention locked on maintaining his authority in front of the client, but in doing so, he reinforced the very barrier that was holding him back. His assumptions weren't loud or obvious. They were subtle, woven into the way he chose who to notice and who to ignore. He adjusted his stance again, shifting his weight as his impatience grew. Every second without progress made the situation feel heavier, yet he never paused to question whether the problem wasn't just the language, but the lens through which he was viewing the people around him. In his mind, the solution had to come from a certain kind of person, someone who matched the image he associated with competence. That image left no room for surprise, no room for hidden skills or unexpected strengths. It narrowed his options before he even explored them. Around him, the office remained still, filled with people who understood more than they let on, but who had learned to stay in the roles assigned to them. The manager's frustration continued to build, but it was directed outward, never inward. He didn't see his own bias shaping the moment. He only saw a problem that wasn't being solved fast enough. His eyes moved again across the room, searching, judging, dismissing, all within seconds, reinforcing a quiet but powerful assumption that ability could be measured at a glance, that worth could be determined by position, that help would only come from those who looked like they belonged at the center of the situation. In the middle of the growing tension, there was one presence in the room that remained steady, almost invisible unless someone made the effort to notice. Near the far end of the office, partially tucked beside a row of cabinets and a supply cart, the janitor moved quietly through his routine. His motions were simple and deliberate, the kind that came from doing the same tasks day after day without drawing attention. A mop bucket rested nearby, its wheels still, while he wiped down a surface with calm focus. He wasn't part of the conversation, not part of the circle forming around the confused exchange at the front, yet he was close enough to hear everything. Every word spoken in Mandarin, every strained response from the manager, every pause filled with uncertainty reached him just as clearly as it did anyone else in the room. Unlike the others, he didn't shift uncomfortably or avoid looking up. He simply listened. His expression didn't change much, but there was a quiet awareness in his eyes, the kind that suggested he understood more than the situation might lead anyone to believe. Still, no one looked his way. The space around him felt separate, not because of distance, but because of perception. He existed in a role that people had already defined for him, one that didn't include stepping into conversations like this. So he stayed where he was, continuing his work, blending into the background in a way that had become second nature. A few employees passed by him without a second glance, focused entirely on the unfolding scene near the entrance. To them, he was just part of the routine, someone who kept the office clean and orderly, someone whose presence didn't require acknowledgement. The manager, caught in his own struggle, didn't notice him at all. His attention was fixed on the client, on the pressure of the moment, on finding a solution within the narrow frame he had already set in his mind. Meanwhile, the janitor paused for a brief second, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the cart as he listened more closely. The Mandarin being spoken wasn't unfamiliar to him. It wasn't distant or confusing. It was clear, precise, and meaningful in a way that contrasted sharply with the confusion surrounding it. He understood the client's words, the intent behind them, even the subtle tone that hinted at patience beginning to wear thin. Yet he said nothing. Not because he couldn't, but because the situation wasn't his to interrupt, at least not in the way the room had been conditioned to expect. His role had never required him to speak up in moments like this, and that unspoken boundary held him in place. He resumed his work, moving the cloth across the surface with the same steady rhythm, though his attention remained divided. The sounds of the strained interaction continued to fill the space, growing heavier with each passing moment. From where he stood, the entire scene was clear, almost simple in its solution, yet complicated by the way people chose to see each other. He glanced up briefly, his eyes moving toward the manager and the client, observing the gap between them, a gap that could be closed with just a few words spoken at the right time. But timing mattered, and so did perception. He knew how he was seen, or rather, how he wasn't seen at all. That understanding shaped his stillness. He wasn't hesitant in his ability, but aware of the space he occupied in the eyes of others. Around him, the office carried on in quiet tension. Chairs shifted slightly, papers were adjusted without purpose, and the low hum of uncertainty settled over everything. The janitor picked up the mop handle, adjusting his grip as he moved a few steps to the side, continuing his routine as if nothing unusual was happening. Yet there was a subtle pause in his movements, a moment where action and decision seemed to meet. He stood within reach of a situation that no one expected him to influence, positioned at the edge of something that was quickly slipping out of control. Still unnoticed, still unacknowledged, he remained part of the background, a presence defined by silence. Even as he held the one thing the room needed most, the shift happened so quietly at first that no one immediately realized what was about to change. The manager was still mid-sentence, his words uneven and uncertain, when a calm voice entered the space with a clarity that cut through the confusion. It wasn't loud or forceful. It didn't demand attention. Yet it carried a precision that made people pause without understanding why. The words were in Mandarin, fluent and natural, spoken with the ease of someone who didn't need to think twice about what they were saying. For a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath. The client's expression changed almost instantly, the tension in his face softening into something more familiar, more at ease. He turned toward the source of the voice, curiosity replacing the quiet frustration that had been building. The manager froze, his thoughts interrupted mid-process as he tried to make sense of what he had just heard. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his gaze followed the client's, shifting away from the center of attention and toward the edge of the room. That was when he saw him. The janitor stood a few steps away, his posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the handle of the mop, as if he had simply paused in the middle of his work. There was no sign of hesitation in his expression, no trace of uncertainty. He spoke again, continuing the conversation in Mandarin with smooth confidence, his tone respectful but assured. The words flowed naturally, bridging the gap that had seemed so wide just moments before. The client responded immediately, his voice carrying a noticeable sense of relief. What had been a strained and fragmented exchange transformed into a clear and meaningful conversation within seconds. The manager remained still, caught between surprise and disbelief. His mind struggled to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. The person he hadn't noticed, the one he had unconsciously dismissed, was now at the center of the interaction, doing effortlessly what he himself could not. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Around them, the office began to shift. Employees who had been pretending not to watch now looked up openly, their attention drawn to the unexpected turn. The quiet background presence of the janitor had been replaced by something undeniable. His voice carried across the room with calm authority, each sentence clear and precise, leaving no room for doubt about his fluency. There was no rush in the way he spoke, no attempt to impress, just a steady, confident delivery that made the conversation feel natural again. The client nodded along, engaged and attentive, asking questions and receiving answers without delay. The ease of the exchange made the earlier tension feel distant, almost unreal. The manager adjusted his stance, his composure slipping further as he tried to regain some sense of control over the situation. He glanced between the two men, searching for an opening, a way to reinsert himself into the interaction that had moved on without him. But the moment no longer belonged to him. It had shifted entirely, centered now on the person he had overlooked. The janitor didn't look toward the manager for approval or acknowledgement. His focus remained on the client, fully present in the conversation, fully aware of what needed to be communicated. There was a quiet confidence in the way he held himself, not in his posture, but in his presence. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply responding to a need that no one else had been able to meet. The rhythm of the room had changed. The earlier anxiety had been replaced by a sense of clarity, a recognition that the problem had never been as complicated as it seemed. It had only required the right voice at the right moment. The manager's earlier assumptions now lingered in the background, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Each word spoken in Mandarin reinforced the gap between what he had believed and what was now unfolding in front of him. The janitor continued, his tone steady, his words precise, guiding the conversation forward without hesitation, holding the room's attention without ever asking for it. The moment the conversation shifted out of his control, the manager felt it in a way that went deeper than simple surprise. It wasn't just that someone else had stepped in. It was who had stepped in, and how effortlessly it had happened. He stood there, watching the exchange unfold in front of him, his mind trying to catch up with a reality that didn't fit the assumptions he had been relying on just minutes earlier. The janitor's voice remained calm and steady, carrying the conversation forward with ease, while the client responded with a level of comfort that had been completely absent before. The contrast was sharp, almost unsettling. The manager adjusted his stance again, but this time the movement wasn't about confidence. It was about grounding himself, trying to steady the unease that had begun to settle in. His hands came together briefly, fingers interlacing before separating again, a small, restless gesture that revealed more than he intended. He wasn't used to being on the outside of a conversation in his own space, especially not one that mattered this much. His eyes moved between the two men, searching for something familiar, some way to interpret what was happening without completely dismantling his expectations. But there was no easy explanation waiting for him. What he was seeing was clear, undeniable, and it challenged the quiet assumptions he had carried without question. The janitor, someone he had barely acknowledged, was now handling a situation he himself had failed to manage. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, layer by layer, with each sentence spoken in Mandarin. Each response from the client added weight to it, reinforcing the fact that this wasn't luck or coincidence. This was skill. Real, practiced, confident skill. The manager's expression shifted subtly, the tightness in his face giving way to something more uncertain. He tried to maintain a neutral look, aware that his staff was watching now, aware that the room had changed in ways he couldn't easily control. His usual sense of authority felt distant, replaced by a quiet awareness that he had misjudged the situation from the very beginning. He cleared his throat lightly, as if preparing to speak, but the words didn't come. There was nothing he could add that wouldn't feel forced or unnecessary. The conversation no longer needed him. That realization lingered, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. He took a small step to the side, not enough to draw attention, but enough to acknowledge the shift in position. He was no longer at the center. The janitor didn't pause or look toward him for direction. He continued speaking with the same steady rhythm, fully engaged with the client, fully in control of the exchange. The manager watched, his thoughts moving quickly now, replaying the moments that had led up to this point. The missed opportunities, the assumptions, the way his attention had passed over the one person who could have solved everything from the start. It was all there, clear in hindsight, impossible to ignore. Around him, the office remained quiet, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't avoidance or tension. It was observation. People were watching more openly, their attention fixed on the interaction, but also on him. He could feel it, the subtle shift in how he was being seen. Not judged outright, but reconsidered. That awareness added another layer to the discomfort, one that pressed in quietly but steadily. He adjusted his tie again, a reflex he couldn't quite control, and let out a slow breath, trying to settle the mix of surprise and realization building inside him. The image he had of the room, of the people in it, no longer felt as solid as it had before. It had been based on patterns, on roles, on expectations that now seemed incomplete. The janitor's voice continued, clear and confident, filling the space with a sense of ease that made the earlier panic feel almost distant. The manager remained still, watching, listening, and slowly coming to terms with the fact that the situation he had tried so hard to control had revealed something he hadn't expected to see. As the conversation continued smoothly, the weight of what had just happened began to settle across the room in a quieter, more lasting way. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no sudden announcement or obvious shift in behavior. Instead, it moved through the space in subtle glances, in the way people held themselves, in the small pauses that carried more meaning than words. The lesson wasn't being spoken out loud, but it was there, clear enough for anyone willing to see it. The manager stood slightly off to the side now, no longer trying to take control, no longer forcing his presence into a moment that had already moved beyond him. His posture had changed without him realizing it. The stiffness that once signaled authority had softened into something more reserved, more aware. His attention stayed on the exchange, but not in the same way as before. He wasn't looking for an opening anymore. He was observing, processing, taking in each detail with a focus that felt different from the urgency that had driven him earlier. The janitor continued speaking with calm confidence, his tone steady, his words precise, carrying the conversation forward without hesitation. There was no sign of performance in the way he spoke, no effort to draw attention to himself. He wasn't trying to stand out. He was simply responding to the moment, meeting the need that had been overlooked. The client listened with ease, fully engaged now, the earlier tension completely gone. Their exchange felt natural, balanced, and clear, a sharp contrast to the confusion that had filled the room not long ago. Around them, the employees who had once avoided eye contact now watched openly, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something more thoughtful. Some leaned back slightly in their chairs, others paused mid-task, but all of them seemed to be taking in more than just the surface of what was happening. It wasn't just about language anymore. It was about perception, about the quiet assumptions that had shaped the moment before anyone realized it. The idea that ability could be measured by appearance or role had been challenged without a single direct statement. It had been revealed through action, through a simple, undeniable demonstration of skill where no one expected to find it. The manager's gaze lowered briefly, not in defeat, but in reflection. His thoughts moved back through the earlier moments, through the choices he had made without thinking, the people he had overlooked without question. There was no immediate way to undo that, no quick response that could smooth it over. The realization sat with him, steady and unavoidable. It wasn't just about this one situation. It was about a pattern, a way of seeing that had gone unchallenged for too long. The room felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the perspective within it had shifted. The janitor, who had once blended into the background without notice, now stood as a quiet reminder of something deeper. Not through words or recognition, but through presence alone. He hadn't asked to be seen, hadn't demanded acknowledgement, yet his actions had redefined the moment entirely. The employees watching began to carry that awareness with them, each in their own way. A few exchanged brief glances, subtle but meaningful, as if confirming that they had all witnessed the same thing. Others simply returned to their work more slowly than before, their focus lingering on what had just unfolded. The manager remained still, his earlier confidence replaced by a more measured awareness. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt, didn't attempt to reclaim the center of attention. Instead, he stood within the moment as it was, no longer shaped by assumption, but by what had been clearly shown in front of him. The conversation in Mandarin continued with steady rhythm, filling the space with clarity, while the unspoken lesson settled quietly into place, reshaping how the room saw not just the situation, but each other.